So we're continuing our series on how is God present in the world. This is kind of the last in this section, and then next week we put everything we've learned over the last months, since September, really October, on, okay, how do we deal with this theodicy problem of if God is all-powerful, all good, why is there all this suffering? And then after that, in March, we're going to look at atonement theories, people's different looks at how the act of the cross actually affects our salvation. And then after that, we're going to look at different people's theologies, understandings of how the resurrection works. And that'll take us up through May, and then hopefully I'll be gone for a month in Ireland. Fingers crossed. All right, so today we're looking at existentialism. So we talked briefly about existentialism way back months ago when we talked about can God suffer. The rise of existentialism is ultimately a response to the insight that we do not only exist, we understand, we are aware that we exist, and we are aware that our existence will one day be terminated by death. There are two certainties in life: you're going to pay taxes and you're going to die. I don't know if you ever heard that before. My dad used to always say it. Maybe yours did too. Existentialism is basically a protest against the view that human beings are things, and a demand that we take the personal experience of the individual with full seriousness. So existentialism is really all based in personal experience. Less so what's going on out there, more so what's going on in our own personal experiences. Thus, it's a philosophy that places special emphasis upon the immediate real-life experience of individuals. So a lot is based on how we feel, how we experience things. It is concerned with the way in which individuals encounter others and gain an understanding of their mortality, of their finitude. So what does this have to say about then the presence of God? The existential approach seems to avoid many of the tricky questions concerning the nature of God's presence in the world. Is God controlling everything? Does God zip in and out periodically to do a miracle here and there, or all that? Because we kind of dealt with, well, how do we balance that? Is God the watchmaker who steps way off? Is God controlling every little thing? Is God sometimes affecting change but choosing not to in other times? And then can we understand God's whims at that? This avoids all of that, but of course it still has problems. So as noted earlier, existentialism focused upon human existence. The presence of God is thus radically restricted to a divine impact or impression upon the subjective world of individual experience. So it's basically all how we experience God, and less kind of an external impact of, I'm going to make the Bengals win the Super Bowl kind of thing. It'd be nice, I'm rooting for the Bengals. So there's one theologian, a guy named Rudolf Bultmann. A lot of these are German guys. His account of the function of Kerygma. Now, Kerygma is the teaching or the proclamation of the good news. So my preaching a sermon is Kerygma. This right here, Kerygma. Issues class, when it's talking about the Bible studies, Kerygma. Kerygma is the teaching proclamation of the good news of the gospel. So he suggests that God confronts individuals through Christian proclamation and subsequently achieves a presence within their lives through a transformed personal existence. In other words, if you, I don't know if this ever happens, but pretend it does. Let's say you go and you hear this amazing sermon at Dairy Presbyterian Church by Reverend Marie Buffalo. And it just changes your life. And you're like, I want to give my life to Christ. I want to transform my entire life. You are experiencing God through that Kerygma. So God's presence is in that teaching moment between Pastor Marie and you. It's that subjective experience. There are obvious affinities here with the Neo-Thomist model we discussed a few weeks ago. Or if you remember, Aquinas talked about primary causes and secondary causes. So God may be the primary cause, and then there are multiple secondary causes. So God would be the primary cause of that transformation. The Kerygma, the sermon that Marie gives, would be the secondary cause. So God is working through Marie to affect that change in your life through the teaching. Does that make sense? So if you've ever gone to anything, you've been to a speaker, anybody ever have a class in college that just changed your life or something like that? I heard a lecture. The idea Bultmann is saying is God is at work in those moments. That less so God is at work in the big picture, God's presence is kind of limited to your personal experience. So, there's good and there's bad about that. So what's it all mean? While avoiding many of the difficulties traditionally associated with the idea of God's presence in the world, this approach seems to radically curtail God's presence to the subjective existence of the individual. God acts only in personal existence, so it's not meaningful to speak of God acting in the world at large. It's in individual experiences. So it's much more micro, less macro in this model. God only said that. Thus, one cannot speak of God acting in the resurrection as with the monarchical model where God raises Jesus from the dead. Because we always say God raises Jesus. Jesus didn't raise himself. God in that moment is entering into the world, affects a change, raises Jesus from the dead. That's God acting in the world. Bultmann would argue the resurrection was an event in the personal experience of the disciples, not in the external world as such. Once more, this seems to lose sight of a considerable element of the Christian understanding of God. So in April, when we talk about different resurrection theories, we'll talk more about Bultmann's theory. So Bultmann would say that the resurrection wasn't so much a physical resurrection of Jesus walking out of a tomb, now he's a human again and all this great stuff. It's more that the teaching, the message of Jesus was raised in the hearts of the disciples, and then they went and shared the good news with people, and that was the resurrection. Almost like when you say, when you had a loved one, well, they're still alive in your memories and in your stories. That's kind of what Bultmann's saying. Now, that misses a key part of what is traditional Christian theology of we believe in the resurrection of the dead. Now, you have to also understand Bultmann is coming at a time when existentialism is a much bigger deal. That's how most people saw the world. It's the world of Camus and Nietzsche and these others. So you have this thing of contextualization. Contextualization is when we try to kind of put things in a context where people are going to understand them, kind of latch onto them more. Paul does this often. Paul changes his writing and what he says to fit the audience. And some people get on Paul about that. It's like, well, you're changing and watering down the gospel for this crew. But Paul knew you can either speak all the same and not affect and reach these people at all, or you can change your context. Have you ever heard a politician change their speech depending on who they're talking to? If you're talking to a bunch of people on Social Security, you may talk different than you're talking to a bunch of corn farmers in Illinois. You change it up. So we often now kind of give Bultmann and some of these theologians a lot of grief, like you are discounting the physical resurrection. At their times, when people were discounting it anyways, they were trying to find a way to still make the resurrection somewhat plausible and somewhat meaningful for people's lives. So in their context, they were trying to basically salvage what they could of these different key Christian ideas like the resurrection. People then eventually leave existentialism. We've had all these philosophical movements throughout the world. There's going to be others where our entire thought processes are different. Theologies often change to adapt because you can either speak to how people are thinking right now or just say, well, if you don't understand it the way we understand it, you're completely lost. And theologians didn't want to do that. So if people were following existentialism, they wanted to find a way to speak to existentialists. If people are following nihilism or any of these postmodernism, you find a way to speak to that moment. So we don't want to judge Bultmann super harshly for being like, well, you discounted the real physical resurrection. He was trying to still make the resurrection a meaningful and important, impactful thing for the Christians in the culture that had kind of living in this existential moment. Which is why we have multiple models to look at that are given over hundreds of years at different times and places. It's why in our book of confessions, we have confessions that were written for a particular moment, but may speak truth in another moment. We have the Barmen Declaration, which the church is speaking against the Nazi regime. We have the Belhar Declaration about apartheid in South Africa. It's in a particular moment, but maybe we can learn something from that moment, even though that moment isn't exactly the same as our moment. So with these different models, you may take some things you like. Well, I like the idea that God is in the teaching and God can affect me as I'm hearing this. But I also like that sometimes God is kind of the monarchical model where God can oversee big change. And I like that God can use individuals in these secondary causes, and these cause and effect, that this person invited me to church and now I'm here and now, all these different things. So it's not that one model is fully correct. As with all things, if we hold all these in tension, we might find the truth somewhere in there. So as we talk about atonement theories during Lent and how the cross works, I'm going to talk again in one of the sermons. One model doesn't hold it all, because the Gospels and the letters of Paul and everything else, they each talk about it in a different way. Because it isn't one exact answer. Because God doesn't say, here is how I'm at work in the world, 5 bullet points. It'd be nice. People experience God differently in the Bibles. They talk about it differently. And they were living in different worldviews. The mythic worldview, and then eventually the Greek philosophical worldview. So how they saw the world affects what they write about. Same thing for us in the more modern world. We think we understand the world with science, and then we learn something different. I'm like, oh, wait, that was not completely right. So now we change how we think about the world. And then we learn something new, and we change again. It's the same thing with philosophy and theology. The more we learn, the more our attitudes and our understandings adapt and change with it. Does that make sense? So the existentialism model fits for how the world was thinking at that time. There's a whole lot more to discuss about existentialism and the different philosophers, Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and Bultmann and all this. But they were responding to how is God present if we understand the world and knowledge works this way. And different people at different times saying, here's how we understand God is at present in the world and how that matters when we understand the world this way. Because our understanding of the world is constantly changing. Probably the way you think about the world is different than maybe you thought about it 50 years ago. Because you've learned more, you've experienced more, you've seen more. Any questions? Next week, we'll look at how people have solved these theodicy problems, looking back at if God is all-powerful, all good, why did bad things happen? And we'll remember, well, is God all-powerful? What does that mean? What does goodness mean? And how much can God actually affect things? How much is God in control of these bad things that happen? And again, we'll look at how several people have answered, and you can find what works for you in the midst of all of that. Thank you all very much.